I'm Dr. Judy Malinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference, and I wanted to share some context for everyone. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death, and the thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. Also for any kind of traumatic injuries. Now we got to talk about natural death for a second. If someone has a heart attack while they are swimming, and because they're having the heart attack as they are exercising in the water and they take on water and they drown, the cause of death is actually drowning, and the heart attack is listed on the death certificate under other significant conditions contributing to death. So even though the heart attack might have killed them on dry land, it might not have. Most certainly they wouldn't have drowned on dry land. So we defer to the hostile environment, which is the water, to call it a drowning. Now, identifying natural disease and identifying trauma is relatively easy in a fresh body. It can be very difficult in a decomposed body. His body was found 2 days after he disappeared, and this second autopsy done by Dr. Roger Mitchell wasn't until 4 days later. So we're dealing with quite a bit of decomposition, even if the body was refrigerated during that time. And then we have this other issue of the fact that not all the results are back. The toxicology would have been done on the fluids from the body from the first autopsy. From the second autopsy, you're going to have a lot higher alcohol levels from the decomposition caused by bacteria, not caused by drinking. So again, it's the fluid and blood from the first autopsy that really matter. And the other thing you have to consider, and there's one other important piece of information from that press conference, which is that the neck block, the portion of the neck from the front end, was missing. So Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well if, injury comes from behind, but generally this part of the neck doesn't have the major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office that was not released with the body. So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that neck block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy that has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. So why should anybody do a second autopsy? A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence, they have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. And to answer the question, if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just, too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning, but the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to 0.20 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving, but you can get up to 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. So I hope this answers some questions about what I saw in the press conference, what other people saw as well. I will go through the autopsy, or at least the report that's been released, with a fine-tooth comb, but this is just my first impressions based on watching the press report.
There is one piece of Nolan Wells that never left the medical examiner's office. Not a photograph, not a file, a physical piece of him, sitting in a jar, in a locked room, months after his family buried the rest of him. Investigators call it the neck block, and until it's released, nobody outside that building can answer the one question this entire case now turns on. We're not going to tell you what we think happened to Nolan Wells. We're going to show you exactly what a second forensic pathologist found, and exactly what he was never allowed to examine. By the end of this video, you'll understand why that missing piece matters more than almost anything else in this file. If new documents surface in this case, this is where you'll hear about them first, before the headlines catch up. Here's where it starts. Within days of Nolan Wells going missing, the sheriff overseeing Jackson County stood in front of a row of microphones and told the public there was no foul play. Sit with the order of events for a second. No autopsy had happened yet. No pathologist had examined the body. The investigation was, by any measure, still at its beginning. And yet the public was handed an ending. For Nolan's family, that press conference wasn't closure. It was the moment their son became a headline before he'd even had a proper examination. A mother and father, still absorbing the worst news of their lives, now watching a stranger in uniform tell the world the story was already finished. That's not an accusation, it's a timeline. And timelines don't lie, even when statements do get softened later. Here's what almost nobody watching that day understood. A body recovered from water is one of the hardest cases in forensic medicine to call quickly. And that's not an opinion. It's a rule pathologists are trained on from their first year in the field. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion. That phrase sounds clinical. Here's what it actually means. A pathologist is never allowed to look at a body pulled from the water and simply write drowning on the certificate. They have to rule out everything else first. Head trauma, neck injury, poisoning, a heart event, a wound hidden beneath swollen tissue. Only once every other door has been closed can drowning be written down as the answer. Think about what that means for a family waiting on the other side of that process. Every day it takes is another day without a name for what happened to their child. Now layer in the timeline that mattered most in Nolan's case. He was missing for several days before his body was recovered from the water. Every one of those days changes what a body can still tell an examiner. Decomposition does not pause for an investigation to catch up. A second independent autopsy was carried out by Dr. Roger Mitchell, days after Nolan was recovered, brought in by the family, alongside attorney Benjamin Crump, after they felt the state's fast public statement didn't match what they were being told privately. But a second autopsy is never a clean slate. By the time Dr. Mitchell examined Nolan, time had already taken things from the body that could never be given back. Refrigeration slows decay, it does not stop it. Picture it this way. The first examiner is reading a fresh page. The second examiner is reading the same page after it's been left out in the weather for days. Some words are still legible, others have faded past recovery. And what Dr. Mitchell found, after everything he was able to examine, was not an accident. It was not a homicide either. It was something far more honest, undetermined. That word gets misunderstood constantly, so let's be precise. Undetermined does not mean nothing happened. It does not mean the family's concerns aren't valid. It means the evidence in front of the examiner wasn't enough to close the door on any single explanation. Not accident, not foul play, not natural causes. One side gave the public a fast, confident answer within days. The other side, working carefully and independently, admitted it could not be certain. That's not two experts disagreeing over how to read the same evidence. That's the difference between a headline and a conclusion. So the question becomes obvious. Why couldn't the second pathologist close the case? He had the training. He had the family's cooperation. He had the body in front of him. What he didn't have was everything. An autopsy can only examine what's physically placed in front of the examiner. And in Nolan's case, one specific section never made it to Dr. Mitchell's table. It's called the neck block, the internal front section of the neck. It had been retained by the state medical examiner's office and was never released with the rest of Nolan's body. Here's why that single detail changes everything about how this case should be read. Different causes of death leave their evidence in different places. When the question is manual strangulation, almost all of that evidence sits in the front of the neck, not the back. The back is mostly muscle and spine. The front holds the airway, the major blood vessels, and the small structures that would show pressure damage if it existed. There are three things a forensic examiner looks for in exactly that region. First, the hyoid bone, a small, delicate, horseshoe-shaped bone sitting high in the throat, largely unprotected, and in some manual strangulation cases, capable of fracturing under pressure. Second, the strap muscles, thin muscles running down the front of the neck, where internal bleeding can appear under compression, even when nothing is visible on the surface. Third, petechiae, pinpoint hemorrhages that can appear when small vessels rupture under sustained pressure, sometimes found around the eyes or the lining of the heart. Every one of those three signs lives in the exact region that was kept back. Retaining tissue during a death investigation is not, on its own, unusual. Medical examiners do this regularly, sometimes to study it further, sometimes to preserve it as evidence. That part is normal procedure, and no one should read retention alone as proof of wrongdoing. But here's the part that should sit with you for a moment. If the state's office retained that tissue, the state's office examined that tissue, and whatever they found from it exists somewhere, in the first autopsy report, a report the public still has not seen. The retention isn't the scandal. The silence around it is. We'll be tracking the moment that report becomes public, piece by piece, the day it happens, not weeks later once everyone else has already picked it apart. There's a second complication in this case that looks simple on paper and isn't. The toxicology. A number on a lab report looks objective. It isn't always. After death, as a body decomposes, bacteria become active, and those bacteria can produce alcohol entirely on their own, with no connection to anything the person drank while alive. In a body that has undergone real decomposition, that internally generated alcohol can climb high enough to cross a legal threshold on bacterial activity alone. Given how many days Nolan's body spent in the water before recovery, any toxicology figure tied to alcohol has to be read with that decomposition factored in, not taken at face value. Here's what that means in human terms. If a number like that gets reported publicly without that context, it doesn't just mislead the public, it can reshape how a grieving family is perceived by strangers who never knew their son, based on a figure that may have nothing to do with anything he did. A careful examiner accounts for the level of decay and checks supporting markers before drawing any conclusion. Anyone treating the raw number as proof of intoxication is working from an incomplete picture. And in a case like this, incomplete pictures get shared far faster than corrected ones. Weeks after that first confident press conference, a reporter showed up in person, pushing for direct answers instead of relying on prepared statements. The tone had shifted. The early certainty was gone, replaced by a much more careful phrase. The case remained under active investigation. Notice what that means. You cannot call something a settled accident and describe it as actively under investigation in the same breath. If it were truly settled, there would be nothing left to investigate. It was never as resolved as the first announcement made it sound. When pressed for specifics, officials pointed elsewhere rather than answering directly. That's not proof of anything by itself, but it is a fair, reasonable question for the public to sit with. How confident can anyone be that a review stayed fully independent in a small county where the people involved often know each other personally? That question is exactly why the family sought a second, outside opinion in the first place. Not for headlines, for a version of events they could actually stand behind. There's a real difference between a case being unsolved and a case being unfinished. Unsolved means the answers are gone. This case is unfinished because the answers still exist. They simply haven't been released. 3 things would move it forward. The original autopsy report, which could finally explain why certain tissue was retained in the first place. The retained neck tissue itself, which hasn't been destroyed, only withheld, meaning an independent examiner could still study it if given full access. And a properly interpreted toxicology report, one that accounts for decomposition instead of presenting a raw number with no context attached. To be completely fair, no crime has been proven here. Nobody has been charged. The independent finding remains undetermined, and nothing in this video claims otherwise. What's undisputed is simpler than any theory. A conclusion was delivered to the public before the examination was even complete. And that single decision is what set this entire debate in motion. Nolan's family isn't asking for a name or a conviction. They're asking for something that should be far easier to give them. The documented truth, released in full, whatever it turns out to be. We don't have the ending of this story yet, but we know exactly what it will take to get there. And when those documents surface, we'll be here to walk through them clearly, without spin, and without waiting for someone else to explain it first. If you want to be here the moment that happens, instead of catching it secondhand, this is the place to stay for it.